Pose 322, Study Session 5, Nationalism. Introduction. In this lecture, which is the first to examine emerging themes in contemporary African political thought, I outline the origin and meaning of nationalism in the African context. I then go on to highlight the elements of nationalist thought and the levels of nationalist actions on the continent. Learning outcomes. At the end of this lecture, you should be able to provide a definition of nationalism in the context of African political thought and practice in the colonial and post-colonial periods. 2. Outline the key elements of these nationalist thoughts. 3. Examine the various levels of nationalist action and implication of these for the continent. And 4. Acquire a good grasp of nature and dimension of nationalism, embodying nationalist thought and practice on the African continent. Meaning of nationalism. Nationalism refers to the feeling or realization among members of a given community that they do belong to that community and that such membership bestows on them a shared political destiny. Such a community could be defined by linguistic, cultural, or territorial boundaries. The critical element is that there should be a consciousness of belonging and psychological response to the community, however defined by its members. Nationalism is thus an indicator of this consciousness and response, to the extent that community members are highly aware and organized around this consciousness. The feeling of nationalism could be said to be high. However, to the extent that the level of awareness and response to the community is low, the feeling of nationalism in the given community could also be said to be low. Nationalism is often passive, but it could also become an active frame of action, especially in conflict situations. Thus, whenever a community imbued with shared nationalist feelings is engaged in a conflict engendered by attempts to expand, defend, or reclaim the community's values, symbols, and artifacts, nationalist feelings and agitations tend to run high. Against this background, we will, in the next section, examine factors and events that have shaped the theory and practice of nationalism and nationalist feelings and agitations in colonial and post-colonial Africa. Nationalism in colonial and post-colonial Africa. As Lecture 3 would suggest, nationalist thought and action in contemporary Africa reflects, in great measure, the influence of colonialism and Islamic penetration of the continent. In the first instance, colonialism and Islam exacerbated old lines of schisms and introduced new ones by bringing together, within new state structures and boundaries, culturally diverse and linguistically homogeneous communities, often previously antagonistic to one another. In the process, they guaranteed, in the post-colonial period, the emergence of African states, often based on societies bifurcated along the lines of ethnic, linguistic, and religious pluralism. The end result has been that the average nation-state in contemporary Africa is in fact a collection of several nationalities existing within the boundaries of the same country. At the same time, however, African agitation against colonial rule and the ensuing nationalist struggle for independence in the colonial territories into which the continent had been carved channeled nationalist agitation along the lines of the colonial state structure. Thus, Africans living under colonial rule in Egypt, Nigeria, and Kenya vented their nationalist spleen, as it were, on the colonial regimes in Egypt, Nigeria, and Kenya, respectively. Given such limited nationalist visions, it was not surprising that the states that emerged after independence largely confirmed the political boundaries arrived at during the partitioning of Africa by the European colonial masters. At the same time, the aggregate of all the specific country-based anti-colonial agitations was to pose the struggle at the macro level as one between African peoples on the one hand and European colonialists on the other. Thus, African perspectives reflected this unity and also posed the nationalist struggle as a continental one meant to rid Africa of colonial regimes. In a nutshell, the structure of nationalism and nationalist agitations in Africa has reflected three levels of thought and action, and they include 1. The ethnic or subnational level, 2. the territorial or nation-state level, and lastly, the continental level. At the ethnic or sub-national level, nationalist thought and action have reflected the competing interests of the pluralities of ethnic and other groups within the various African states. This has spurred the literature of ethnic philosophy and a focus of intellectual effort on the elaboration of the worldviews, experiences, and interests of these groups as they coexist in the various African countries. At the level of action, it has created problems of cohesion for these countries. Its divisive tendency has also occasionally led to civil unrest and civil wars, as has been witnessed in Nigeria, Ethiopia, Uganda, and Zaire. At the territorial or nation-state level, nationalism and nationalist thought and action sought to invoke pan-cleavage symbols to forge a common anti-colonial front in the battle for sovereign independence for the African colonial territories in achieving their aims. However, they also recognize the balkanization of Africa and preserve the territorial divisions that has resulted from colonial adventures in the continent. At the third level, nationalist consciousness conceived of Africa as a community providing the framework for action and attempted to extend the boundaries of action beyond those of nation-states, which were artificial creations of colonial rule, to cover the entire continent. I'm sure that by now it is clear to you that nationalism as a body of thought and a call to action in Africa has generated forces often in opposition to and in conflict with one another. As several African writers, including Ali Mazrui, have shown, nationalist thought and practice has been a reactive, in the sense that it was born out of reaction to a situation created by external intrusion in the form of colonialism and Islamic penetration. B. Divisive, in the sense that it has sanctioned the balkanization of Africa along lines dictated by the colonial scramble for Africa, even as it has created room for competing nationalism among ethnic and other cleavages in the nation-states that emerged in Africa after colonial rule. C. Protective, in the sense as indicated above, that it has encouraged attempts to organize communities in the defense of traditional values and artifacts against emergent or real danger. 4. Restorative, in trying to restore perceived dignities, uniting frames or symbols of the past. 5. Assertive, in pushing for a new image of Africans as being part of humanity. And 6. Creative, in moving forward to pursue the argument that the dignity of man was indivisible, while the words of Patrice Lumumba, one of the leading African nationalists of his time, balancing with the perspective that recognized the Africanness of Africans, brothers in race, brothers in conflict. In all these apparently contrastive elements, you can still be assured that nationalist thought and action has had its uniting focus. It is a nationalism that calls for equality, freedom, prestige, and dignity for African peoples, insisting in the words of Mazrui that we are all men, by insisting that the dignity of man is indivisible. African nationalist thought has contributed towards the creation of an environment conducive to the enhancement of the dignity of man at the global level. Study session summary. Nationalist thought in Africa, which deals with ideas on the nature and dimensions of the consciousness and psychological response of Africans to their political community, reflects the consequences of colonial and Islamic intrusion into Africa. This intrusion has generated a structure of nationalist thought and action made up of 3 levels of nationalism: the ethnic or subnational, the territorial or nation-state level, and the continental level. End of study session 5. Thank you for listening.